okay, for posterity. As I was saying, we had an interesting last day yesterday on legislation, a potential source of funding for those of you that heard the attorneys yesterday. The state decided to file a lawsuit against the manufacturer. So my session ended with, we don't know where the funding is going to come. So at least we're going to have another arrow in the quiver in this industry to figure out how rehabilitation is going to be addressed. We're going to move a little bit from politics and whatnot into what most of us enjoy, which is PFAS assessment and management. So today we have, this session, we have 4 topics, presentations. One of them is my site's got PFAS. Time to go back to the drawing board, and I agree with that. And then a case study of implementing PFAS in the absence of regulations from the city of Tampa. Full spectrum solutions for the subsurface management of PFAS from Chad, and a PFAS leaching from AFFF-Impacted source areas from Nguyen. So we're going to go ahead and start with Blaine Dawson. Go ahead and jump on.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining bright and early here. I'm going to walk you through my presentation on sort of kind of dovetailing on what we talked about yesterday with, if you look for it, you're probably going to find it. So my site has PFAS. It's time to go back to the drawing board. So what I wanted to sort of highlight in this is that as we're sort of approaching our due diligence side of things, typically the big picture approach has been, what is the PFAS generating potential of both the site and offsite parcels? And I sort of want to highlight there's some other aspects that I think are very critical as we sort of do our original evaluation of our sites in the event that we do need to evaluate for PFAS. So I got a long laundry list of things on here, but big picture, we'll take you through sort of a case study in which a site has been a legacy within the program system for a very long time, and then how PFAS has sort of come into the picture, what we did to initially evaluate the site from just sort of a available document perspective, what we did for assessment, what we found, and then how we kind of had to go back to the drawing board to try to make sense of what it was that we saw, and then sort of our supplemental approach, and then sort of some tools as we sort of approach this next phase in our efforts of completing site assessment, which is ultimately the goal for a lot of these. So, as most of you have likely experienced in your careers here, I'm just kind of highlighting a couple here as far as assessment. We've looked at petroleum compounds, chlorinated solvents, metals, and the typical go-to tried and true methods for a lot of that is going to be your pump and treat, SVE, air sparge, injection and excavation. And the case study I'm presenting today has essentially had everything, all of that, over a 25-year history. It's been Swiss cheesed, a lot of influence to the aquifer as we've attempted to remediate these contaminants over time. So I'll bring it now to sort of present day just to provide some sort of context. Really all that we have left is we have a petroleum hydrocarbon plume that's extending from the subject site down gradient to the northeast. The source area is clearly sort of on the subject parcel in an area called the loading dock. Geosyntec was part of a interim source removal in 2016 that addressed some vadose impacts on the subject parcel. And some of our assessment, we did look at whether or not there was some groundwater surface water interaction between those petroleum hydrocarbons and a stormwater drainage ditch that runs along the northern part of the properties. And I'm just sort of providing this as context for how we then developed our approach for our PFAS assessment. So, as we know, new contaminant on the block, we had PFAS becoming the hot topic lately. So in reference to the subject site, it's been involved with a lot of manufacturing over the years. They did paints, varnishes, dyes, and inks from the 70s up until about the late 80s. And then they transitioned to more plastics in sort of from 93 till 2019. At that point, upon cessation of operation, we did some pilot testing for some former hazardous waste sites, collecting samples from sort of our hottest wells for sort of the COCs of the time. And of course, if you look for it, you're going to find it. And so we found it in groundwater at the site. which then elicits a more formal approach to evaluate what the extents of those impacts are and what's contributing to it. So as part of our sort of background evaluation, as we call our desktop assessment, in the past, it's been primarily focused on identifying whether or not the subject site is the source or whether or not offsite parcels in either direction have the potential to be a source. And then once you identify that, where are your receptors? Where's the potential risk there? And so from there, we develop a very baseline conceptual site model. And so as part of the desktop assessment, we really have only focused on using just the available historical records for sort of property appraiser, environmental database, contaminator locator map, and just any other historical documents we can get our hands on. This, again, has been very focused on identifying whether or not the subject site could be a source or it could be coming from an offsite potential. So when we originally got those results back, we developed sort of our approach. We're going to do our discrete soil sampling across the subject site. We'll do a site-wide groundwater sampling out there. We will look at the stormwater ditch evaluation. It runs sort of on the northern parcel and does flow from an offsite source across our subject property, then further down gradient offsite to a larger surface water body. And so we wanted to see if sediment or surface water have been potentially impacted by some of that. And then for offsite, really just doing select groundwater sampling, no more intrusive work there, because the goal of this was to identify the subject site if that had the potential to be the source. So what we found for soil impacts, we had sort of very, very discrete soil sampling across the site. Most of those impacts were located within the upper 6 inches, and it really was in sort of two discrete locations. For reference on the figure here, the darker gray outline is in reference to that 2016 interim source removal we did. So we did collect sort of samples adjacent to that. And with the dashed lines on there, we do not have completive delineation, so that required us to do some supplemental that, based on the location of some of these borings, would require some off-site soil sampling. For groundwater, we identified a plume that extended from our subject site, not only across the adjacent parcel to our east, but further down gradient as we approach some of those surface water bodies. With our observed highest contamination, sort of the red outline there. Granted, this site isn't as screaming hot as most have been influenced with, but this is important to realize as we are getting some of these potential dry cleaner sites evaluations, some of these reopeners, sort of understanding how to develop our CSMs from this. For sediment, we didn't really observe any significant impacts. In the upper right-hand corner, we did observe a PFAS impact, and what's important with that is that as part of their groundwater pump and treat system, they had the system located in the northeast portion of the site, and as water was processed through it, it was discharged to that stormwater ditch, which flows from the west to the east, so left to right on our figure here. For surface water, we identified some cleanups of the initial screening criteria at both of our sampling locations. And so kind of bringing it home to sort of what we found was there were limited soil concentrations on the subject site. We observed a groundwater plume that was up gradient of those impacts on the subject parcel. And then our highest concentrations were observed down gradient and off-site, not just the adjacent parcel, but the parcel beyond. We did see some surface water exceedances with some minor detections in sediment as well. So sort of our hypothesis when reviewing this is that there certainly is the potential for an off-site source here that we need to investigate, but with the way that we are evaluating these sites, we have to be careful with how we're approaching sort of that conversation and that approach for collecting those data points. And so if the subject site truly is the sole source, we had to figure out what explains how the groundwater concentrations are increasing down gradient and off-site with the highest observed, as well as how we're getting groundwater exceedances up gradient of where we did observe some of those shallow soil impacts. And so this is where we did a dive into the past of site activities. So as I mentioned before, there were significant influences to the aquifer over the duration this site's been assessed. Figure on here represents sort of their pump and treat system and their proposed radius of influence. And so you can see that it not only addresses the subject site, which has sort of the darker dashed lines on the center left portion of the figure here, but it does extend off-site to the east. So there is potential of capture of groundwater from an off-site source as part of the work they were doing. They expanded this system with some in situ chemical oxidation about 5 years later. They extended even further their pump and treat system in 2002. This again just showing the amount of influence they're expecting to have on the aquifer within their areas of influence. And then again in 2016, this was sort of our soil excavation of which we removed the petroleum impacts at the site. So as you can see, there was significant disturbances to the aquifer, including potentially some of the PFAS plume, whether that could be artificially migrated or redistributed in a different area of the site. Based on that, we identified the pump and treat system as having significant potential for migrating that PFAS impacted groundwater. And again, the system effluent was discharged into a stormwater drainage ditch that flowed off-site and into a larger body of water. Additionally, as we delved deeper and were able to get into some historical records, we found the adjacent parcel to, on the down gradient direction, was a former fire safety company. And so something that was important for us as we expanded our assessment efforts, clearly we needed to do more groundwater soil impacts evaluation, but as these impacts are approaching that larger surface water body, we needed to evaluate whether or not there could be some surface water groundwater interaction that could require some more in-depth, more intensive assessment remediation there. But I always like to highlight again here that the goal of this is really to complete site assessment associated with the subject parcel. We're not necessarily sneaking around off-site trying to find that smoking gun for the other part. So for the soil, when we went back and did our additional investigation, we identified on the off-site parcel, sort of in the northeast corner of there, the highest soil impacts we've seen on site, extending from land surface to the water table. We were able to delineate the impacts on site. However, the off-site impacts remain undelineated, so additional assessments warranted. For groundwater, surface water, sort of presenting them here together, the plume was extended. We went into DPT groundwater, trying to identify those extents. However, they do appear to be approaching that surface water body. And as part of our surface water sampling, the stream on the right-hand side does flow from north to south, and we did see an observed increase in PFAS as you go down gradient within that water body, indicating that further evaluation assessment that's needed. And then our hottest zone, sort of in purple, is co-located with that leachability issues that we saw on the adjacent parcel. And so the big picture here is sort of how we are approaching that evaluation of whether or not that's definitively our source or whether our subject site could be contributing in some way. And so this is where we're kind of digging through our toolbox of helping both regulators as we evaluate, who has the potential to be creating the contaminations we see. So we did our desktop evaluation, we completed that. Our traditional site investigation, we're presently in progress, there's additional work necessary. But sort of what was highlighted yesterday in one of those presentations was the idea of using forensics. And I think it's going to be a nice tool, particularly in this case, as we have potentially two different sources. We have the potential for AFFF, we have the potential for some manufacturing processes. So as we get more into the identification of who's likely contributing, it could be a nice tool to help throughout that process. And so for me, I think there's something to always learn from all of our experiences. And so some of my big takeaways is, the past can and will influence the future. So when we're doing these evaluations of these sites from the due diligence side, we can't just look at the PFAS generating potential of a site. We really have to look at what historical influences a site has had on it to potentially migrate either influences from the site to off-site or off-site on-site. It will play an important role in identifying whether or not there is risk as we're approaching these sites. And then repurposed tools such as forensics are incredible value. We've used them for PAHs, PCBs in the past, and I think they're going to provide a great tool as we move forward in evaluating where the PFAS source may or may not have originated from. So, thank you.
Blazingly fast. That's great. Blaine, you're next. Great job.
Good morning. Hi, I'm McLane Evans. I'm an assistant city attorney for the city of Tampa. My presentation is going to be a little bit different, not so much technical based, but more to sort of let you see behind the scenes of the decision-making process on one of those municipalities who was a recipient of one of those letters from DEP about potentially being liable at their fire training facility that you heard about yesterday. So the title of my presentation is a case study on implementing PFAS remediation strategy in the absence of regulation. Just to give you an idea, those of you who aren't from the Tampa area, the fire training facility is on that southernmost point. Let me see if I can get the point right down there. A peninsula. That bay there is called McKay Bay. It outlets into Hillsborough Bay and then Greater Tampa Bay outside there. This is a closer view. Also, something that should be noted is the surrounding land use. So the box in blue is the actual fire training facility, but as you can see, it's completely surrounded by commercial uses. This here is the Crosstown Expressway. Just north of that is State Road 60. There's additional commercial to the north of that and to the northeast. The closest residential, I have a radius later map that you'll see, is over here. And then this is even closer view, just to give you an idea. The city of Tampa actually owns the surrounding properties, and these are all municipal uses. At the very north end is our waste energy plant. Just south of that is the police impound lot. Then you have the entrance into the transfer station, the waste station here, the old transfer station for solid waste here, the new transfer station that just opened last month. This is the actual facility that we're talking about here for the fire training facility. To the south is the police evasive maneuvers lot and course, and then to the east of that is the police firing range. And of course, we're here because the city, during its training, we received donations from the port and the airport of aqueous film forming foam and used it in our training. And there may have also been some purchases in the past. We're not 100% sure on that. Just to give you a picture of what it looks like on the ground, if you haven't been to a fire training facility before, you've got your fire tower. These are the kind of places that the fires would have been set for practice, and the foam probably would have been used. You've got the fire tower on the left. You've got confined area practice facilities, and also open fire pits. And they would have set fires in all those locations, and in fact, sometimes just directly on the asphalt. Fun fact, since we were doing those yesterday, about 10 years ago, I volunteered to be in the Citizens Emergency Response Team. Has anyone ever heard of that? It's through FEMA. It's to help your neighbors out in emergencies. And the fire department, the trainers there, so we got to train at this facility, and they set practice fires on the asphalt for us here to help us learn how to use the fire extinguishers. So I may have actually contributed. So just to give you an idea of the process, you heard about this yesterday, I won't take too much time. Florida Department of Environmental Protection sent out questionnaires to fire training facilities across the state. Those that responded that they either had used AFFF or may have used AFFF, they then sent their contractor out to collect samples. And for the city, that was in May of 2019, and then followed that up with a letter advising that they would prefer that we do 62780. That's the administrative code Frank Hearn was telling you about yesterday, the cleanup rule for the state of Florida, asking that we do a risk-based site assessment and remediation. During that sample collection event, they took surface water, groundwater, soil, and sediment samples. In the letter they sent back to us, they said that the groundwater exceeded EPA's health advisory levels and their provisional groundwater cleanup target levels, their provisional soil cleanup target levels, and then the sediment, they also said, exceeded those soil target levels, and advised of potential responsibility to assess and remediate. I will say, Jorge yesterday said that the letter said you have liability. There was an important word he forgot to mention. They said, the letter says you may have liability. So now the city had to determine how to proceed. And as a municipality, we have a lot of obligations to balance. First and foremost, we're charged with protecting public health and safety, the whole reason we have a fire department in the first place. We have to protect the environment. We have fiscal responsibility to our taxpayers. Unlike some of the scenarios you heard yesterday with smaller municipalities, like Pensacola with only 50,000, the city of Tampa has approximately 400,000 citizens, which means bigger budgets, but it also means bigger expenditures to serve all of those citizens. So just like any local government, the needs every year are assessed, budgets are allotted. So if you decide that the now superseding urgent need is to engage in remediation, those dollars come from some other need that won't get met that year or perhaps in future years. And of course, we have a responsibility to maintain regulatory compliance. So then we had to do a legal analysis. So that's my department's thing. The first thing we looked at was the provisional cleanup levels set by the state were not put through Chapter 120, which is the state of Florida's Administrative Procedures Act. Similar to the Federal Administrative Procedures Act, if you've heard of that before, it provides notice, hearing, and public comment periods, and that did not occur with these standards. As such, they are not enforceable standards. Additionally, this is going to get a little complicated, and I apologize. So Chapter 62-780, the cleanup rule that, again, Frank mentioned yesterday, they talked about it thoroughly on the attorney's panel, so I won't go into it too much, is the directive on cleaning up. It also relies on the list in 62-777 of the constituents that have to be cleaned up. That's simple. But for 62-777 to apply, first 62-70 has to apply. For that to apply, the statutes from which it derives its authority must apply, and those are Chapter 376 and 403. Chapter 376 is commonly referred to as the Pollution Discharge Prevention and Control Act. It was originally passed in the early 80s for our tanks program. It was for petroleum and petroleum systems cleanup, and it was modified in the early 90s to include hazardous substances. However, the subsection from which our cleanup rule derives its authority specifically excludes any use of that section to create or establish new liability for site rehabilitation at a contaminated site. Meaning, in this particular situation, but for PFAS constituents, it's not a contaminated site. Therefore, it seems that 376 wouldn't apply. So then Chapter 403 is the Florida Air and Water Pollution Act. It governs discharges essentially of solid waste and hazardous substances. But PFASs aren't solid waste, and they have been classified as a hazardous substance. And so therefore under 403, our conclusion was that the city of Tampa doesn't qualify as an owner, operator, or other person who would generate, transport, handle, dispose of, treat, or store solid waste. So from our perspective, that test fails also. And then finally, as the EPA mentioned yesterday, their health advisory levels are non-binding, non-enforceable drinking water evaluation tool, essentially. So then going back to our obligations, separate and apart from whether or not the discussion of whether or not we're actually bound to follow those rules at this particular situation, we want to consider the risk to our actual neighbors and constituents. So as I mentioned earlier, that rectangle shape here that is about 120 acres. It's all owned by the city and all has commercial uses, as are all the surrounding uses for quite a significant distance. The two circles you see on this image to the left, this is 3/4 of a mile, the inside circle, and you'll see that the residential neighborhood starts on the outskirts of the interior of that distance. And then the second line is 1.25 miles from the center of the fire training facility. And there's no potable wells for at least 1 mile from the site also. So that was another major consideration for us. So we've got surrounding land uses of all commercial, industrial, and no drinking water supply within a radius that would presumably be affected. So essentially, wait, can I go back? Yeah. So essentially with that information, the city decided at this point, while the rules are provisional, obviously at some point there's going to be some sort of permanent rule, be it federal, state, or both, and we want to continue moving forward on that. We also want to protect the health and safety of our citizens and the environment. So, but getting back to that fiscal responsibility, with a constantly moving target, we didn't think it was rational or responsible to our taxpayers to expend funds to actually do remediation while A, it's still in its early stages of development, and B, the actual goal is unknown at this point. So we could expend a huge amount of money right now to get to the 70 parts per trillion, and then find out in a year or two that it's actually a much lower standard and have to go do the effort all over again, and then we'd have to explain that to all of our citizens, which would not go over well. So since there seemed to be no apparent immediate health and safety risk at this point, our decision is to meet and collaborate with DEP, which we did, talked about their provisional status, stay in touch with them on how that's progressing and whether or not they're going to enter into rulemaking in light of the recent legislation. If the governor signs that, they're sort of on hold until January 2025 at this point. But in the meantime, we provide regular monthly updates to them on what we're doing and what our plans are. So we stay in regular contact and are collaborating with them. We also hired Aptum to conduct additional sampling and help us determine where would be the most sensible places to put in permanent monitoring wells and sampling stations. We did the same array of sampling to include soil, sediment, surface water, and groundwater. This just gives you an overview of our soil samples. The DEP Geosyntec for DEP in 2019 did the sampling, and then we've also done soil sampling in 2021 and 2022. Additionally, we set up permanent monitoring wells. 3 of them are as close as possible to the temporary wells that DEP originally set, so that we can track those constituents from as close as possible to their sampling locations. And then some of the others are situated to try to find the boundaries of some of the hits that we've been getting, and we continue to evaluate those results. Next steps right now, we're going to continue to work with DEP, keep them posted, and track the legislative atmosphere as things change and as technology and regulations change. We'll continue reevaluating our approach and adjusting. And we'll, of course, continue proactive efforts to protect the environment and the public on all fronts. And we had sent, on the attorneys panel yesterday, Laurel Lockett mentioned some of the legislation efforts that have been put before the Florida legislature, one of which was that more extensive bill in 2020 that included local government's ability to participate in the brownfield site rehabilitation agreements. There's some people that are concerned, obviously, if the funding stays at the same levels and you add PFAS to that, it would drain the funds. So there would have to be some sort of adjustment, presumably, if they did that, on how they fund it. But the principle of including PFAS in local governments or governmental agencies we support, and we had written a letter of support for that legislation at the time, and will continue to do so for similar legislation and support through the League of Cities. But we'd also support some sort of separate legislation that was specific to PFAS constituents. And then, of course, the legislation that was just passed in this last session that's waiting for the governor's signature dictates that DEP is not supposed to do anything for the next 2 years while they wait for EPA to set cleanup target levels. If that doesn't happen by January 2025, then we'll see what DEP does, and as I said, continue to adjust and assess and comply with the law as it changes. Thank you.
Thank you. That shows the variety of responses, McLane. In some cases, some people are applying the risk management approach of just sit tight and wait. Some cities have responded differently. Yes, sir.
So the city doesn't think it's responsible for, at this point, remediation, but the city feels responsible for assessment at this point, legally?
The question, we want to restate that question?
You're asking an attorney that in front of a big audience, so I'm going to say it depends. That's the standard. But essentially what I was saying was, under the current laws addressing PFAS constituents, we determined we're not legally responsible. However, because there is evidence out there that PFAS, A, potentially has health complications, and B, is going to be listed at some point, the city found it's just simply a policy decision rather than feeling like that we have a legal obligation to do it, other than our basic responsibility as a municipality to make sure that we continue to protect the public health. Correct. We don't believe that any of the existing standards that have been applied or addressed and sent to us in that letter actually are enforceable at this time. That's the bottom line.
And just to follow up, I think that's the standard response you're going to get. I mean, is DEP legally able to enforce assessment? The answer that you're going to get is no. But they have a duty to respond to their constituents, and they've done so, the cities and so on. Yes, Joe? Hang on, you get in the microphone so everybody can listen to.
We got people on Zoom.
So yesterday there was a lot of talk about who's going to develop the next number. I was just curious, have you heard any feedback from DEP on whether they're going to wait and see and then try to develop a number? Because it takes a process and a while to come up with cleanup target levels for DEP, to work with industry and risk assessors to come up with those. So if they wait and EPA doesn't issue an MCL, they're going to be behind the 8 ball come February 2025, right? So I have not heard any feedback from DEP on what they're going to do in the interim, if they're going to go ahead and proceed with developing the numbers, or if they're just going to wait.
My understanding, based on conversations with leadership at DEP, the strategy is to wait for the EPA to come up with a rule. As we know, the EPA has never gone through the rulemaking process of declaring a hazardous substance to CERCLA. So it's an unknown process for them. More than likely, and McLane might tell you this, that rule is going to be challenged also in federal court. Save for that, and I think DEP is going to wait a little while to see where the winds blow in the federal stage before they decide to go on their own. Notwithstanding that, I mean, the legislature has injected themselves into the process by saying any standard, whether it's below detection limits or higher than 70, it has to be ratified by them because there is an economic component that, many times some agencies tend to.
So if EPA comes out with the MCL, that still has to be ratified by the legislature?
It has to be ratified according to the law, correct, McLane? Yeah,
So
it has to be ratified. Now, sorry, Joe. Go ahead.
So if EPA does not come up with the MCL by February of 2025 and DEP hasn't developed a number, is there any repercussions from the legislature?
DEP has to develop their rule by 2025.
Right, but if they're waiting, we all know it takes.
Yeah, it's going to take a while.
780 took 4 or 5 years to get
Yeah.
revised back
It is gonna take a while. So again, depends on how the strategy works at DEP. I'm sure somewhere around 2023, they're gonna say, well, we gotta start this process no matter what because the legislative intent's there. What I asked Teresa yesterday is, what about the continuing obligations of the folks that have received these letters in light of the recent legislative law that says, look, tap your brakes, let's all figure out where we're gonna go. DEP doesn't have a response, but most of them are leaning towards the city of Tampa. If there's no risk, let's stand down a little bit, let's figure things out. That's gonna be the response, which I think is consistent with what the city has done.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Now we're gonna move to, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Besides DEP, suppose you have a neighbor just downflow of this, knows you had a firefighting school there, has heard PFAS on the news and everything, and wants to make a quick buck by suing you all now because you really haven't done anything as far as cleanup. So a continuous contamination will occur on that neighbor's property from the groundwater flow. Is that a major concern?
Is this one on?
Yep.
Based on our current data, we don't see that as a concern, both the fact that there aren't any, the closest well is far, far beyond where we're finding detection limits. So other than a potential PR issue that would have to be addressed, I don't see that as being an issue because that's why we're doing the monitoring so that we can see the edges of where the constituents are at this time.
I was speaking one time for potential use of resource groundwater.
Well, people can sue you for anything. The question is, are they going to win?
I think part of the response is potential versus actual risk. You know, DEP works on potential risk, and that's fine. But at some point in time, as I said yesterday, the paradigm's going to start to change to actual risk as the city figure it out. We don't only have consumptive use permits, but we also have irrigation well permits. And so we begin to, enter different areas, but from potential to actual risk, that's where I think the industry eventually is going to have to move because there's not enough money to clean this to unknown levels yet. I mean, right now we're working with an unenforceable level, as most attorneys have said. What if the level goes down to 10 parts per trillion? Probably it's going to be very expensive to meet that concentration. So again, I think there's a difference between potential and actual risk in all situations, and that's where I think everything is going to go eventually here, regardless of where the rule goes. Any other questions? Okay, now we're gonna go to when people decide to do something about it, right, Jan?
Sure.
Okay.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. Hope you've had as much coffee as I have. And we are going to venture into the use of colloidal activated carbon to address PFAS impacts. I'm gonna go ahead and start with a question. And that is, do we need a forever solution for forever chemicals? Last year, I spoke here about some case studies, what we've been doing the last several years using colloidal activated carbon in the subsurface. This year, I want to go under the hood a little bit, kind of poke around and talk about more of the how and the why and the what. If you watched Dr. Hetzinger's presentation yesterday, this actually would be a nice segue for some of those questions that he had brought up. So we'll start here. What is the problem that we're seeing in the subsurface right now? So a lot of these sites, as we're starting to delineate them, what we're seeing is these things are running wild and free across the remedial landscape, in some cases for miles as we continue to look for them. And part of that is because the normal degradation processes in the subsurface that usually kind of keep things at bay aren't at play here. So these things are really getting out of control in some cases. And as they're doing that, besides the on-site liability that we might see, these things are going off-site. They're crossing property boundaries. They're running into sensitive receptors, whether that be residential wells, municipal wells, surface water bodies, all kinds of stuff along these very long paths that these things are taking. So the general strategy that we've been applying is the use of a permeable reactive barrier, PRB, that's applying a colloidal activated carbon, an injectable carbon, into the subsurface. And that allows for a few different things. One, there's an attenuation or slowing down of the contaminants as they're migrating in the subsurface. So we can essentially attenuate the plume and slow it down for a very long period of time. And the mechanism that we're really applying here is enhanced attenuation. So our friends at ITRC describe it as this: the result of applying an enhancement that sustainably manipulates a natural attenuation process, leading to an increased reduction in mass flux of contaminants. So we're going to explore that a little bit more and what that means and break it down. So there's some clear advantages to taking this sort of strategy, right? There's no infrastructure involved. There's no ongoing O&M. This is really a passive versus active management strategy. We're not generating any waste. We're not pulling anything out and creating media that's been impacted above ground. And because it's carbon, we can achieve these low treatment standards of parts per trillion. I'll dig into that a little bit more too in a bit. And what we're seeing is that we're able to do this at least for decades. We're going to talk about the modeling involved and that supports that. And then, of course, this all kind of translates to a very cost-effective strategy long-term for PFAS. And we're going to add one more thing, that if we're able to manage the source, and there's a lot of different things we've been talking about over the last day or two, that we can get some of that mass discharge down, we can minimize the flux of contaminants coming to the barrier, then I'd suggest that maybe we could actually do a single application of this, and that may work indefinitely. Maybe forever solution? Time will tell. So here's some of the questions. Again, Dr. Hatzinger brought some of these up. So these are similar, and we're going to dig into these a little bit. So without contaminant destruction, how does this fit with remediation? That's a fair question, a common question that we talk about a lot. And then how long does this stuff last? What's the longevity? How do we predict longevity? How do we adjust this so we can get a desired longevity? And then finally, can we actually implement a colloidal activated carbon barrier successfully and in the subsurface? And how do we do that? How do we measure that? What are the parameters for it? So I'm going to go back way up. We're going to go way back to the definition of remediation. Right? We don't think about this too often, but I think it's essential to understanding where are we going? What are we doing with this stuff? So again, our friends at ITRC say it's a process used to reduce or eliminate the risk for humans in the environment that may result from exposure to harmful chemicals. So eliminate the risk. We're going to hang out on that term. So what is risk? The engineer in me, at least what's left of the engineer in me, always puts everything into equations. So risk equals hazard times exposure. All right? So the EPA has established several criteria, 3 general ways in which natural attenuation processes translate to reducing risk and exposure. So first of all, it's transformation of contaminants to a less toxic form. So this would be something similar to enhanced reductive dechlorination. We take a parent product, PCE, we reduce it to ethene, an innocuous sort of substance. A second would be a reduction in contaminant concentration. So in my world, that would be chemical oxidation, for example. We would completely destroy, essentially, these contaminants. The third thing that applies in this scenario is a reduction of the contaminant mobility and bioavailability. So here we're trying to reduce the mobility of it by binding it up within the carbon in that matrix. So by reducing the exposure, the mobility, we also therefore reduce the risk, eliminate the risk. So there's a risk mitigation strategy. So there's been some precedent set for this for PFAS. Certainly, we all are aware of decades of use of M&A, monitored natural attenuation or enhanced attenuation for dealing with recalcitrant compounds like metals or chlorinated solvents and such. More recently, Chuck Newell, if you've never heard of him, he's kind of what I'd call a heavy hitter in our industry. He supported lots of development of documents for EPA, of software for EPA. So he's one of those guys, when he talks, you listen, you know. So he published a paper at the end of last year with his colleagues saying, hey, there is a precedence for using M&A or enhanced attenuation for treatment of PFAS. And in that, one of the things that he says, there's multiple pathways to that, but he talks about the use of different sorbents to create an enhanced attenuation mechanism. So in our case, a sorbent example would be the technology like Plume Stop. So this is a liquid activated carbon, a colloidal activated carbon, some different terms for it. But there's a couple key characteristics I'd point out if you're not familiar with it. One is that its size. It's 1 to 2 microns. So to put that in perspective, that's about the size of a red blood cell. Or I think as Dr. Hatzinger said yesterday, the size of bacteria. Right? This is small stuff. It's hard to think of as a particle. Whereas granular activated carbon that many of us are familiar with is like 1,000 microns. So this is 1,000 times smaller than that particle size. And the second is it's suspended in an organic polymer. So that organic polymer allows it to disperse and move, not indefinitely. It breaks down, degrades as the carbon bonds to the matrix, but that allows this high volume, low pressure, wide area distribution of the material in the subsurface, essentially converting it to a subsurface filter, a purifying filter. So this isn't a new technology. It's innovative, but it's not new. It's a mature technology at this point with about 15 years of history behind it. It's been used on hundreds of sites for petroleum hydrocarbons, for chlorinated solvents, but now we've been using it for the past 5 years for the application or addressing PFAS impacts. Again, there's a lot of good case studies out there, some of which I presented last year. Come see me later if you guys want to talk about those a little bit more. There's a lot of third-party research going on currently. Some of these are EPA-funded studies. Again, like Dr. Hatzinger mentioned yesterday, he's involved with some of those and some in the consulting community, as well as some in academia at the University of Waterloo, for example. So lots of current ongoing research going on by others for the use of this strategy. All right, so let's talk about longevity. So how long does this stuff last? How do we know? How do we predict it? Can we confidently say this stuff really is going to work for decades? So you may have seen this image. So this is pre-injection of carbon. So these are actually sand particles, individual sand particles at 0 to 20 micron scale, right? So that's showing you what that surface looks like before we inject carbon. After injection, you can see that nice thin layer. It's as if we painted the particles individually with the carbon. And that's a permanent binding. So that is indefinite. It becomes a permanent part of the matrix. So the question is, how long is that going to work, and how does it work in the subsurface for us? And I'll point out that our goal when we're injecting generally is to get it into what we call the flux zone. So the flux zone is where the bulk of the mass is moving through. This is the higher permeability zone. This is kind of where the plume behavior and architecture and shape is being formed. So that's where we're targeting injection of this material. And below that, we may have low permeability zones or intermixed with that, and there's mass stored up in there, but as it back diffuses out, it's going to come into these zones and be treated. So we can manage any back diffused mass over the long term, and the same could be said for anything that infiltrates from above, if we have mass coming from a source zone. So this is why carbon works. And this isn't particular to colloidal activated carbon. If you guys have seen this curve before, this is a isotherm, or specifically a Freundlich isotherm. So this describes basically an equilibrium for a particular mass of carbon and the absorbed mass of a contaminant and the resultant equilibrium concentration in groundwater. So what's unique about this curve is kind of how it dives down at the left side of that graph. And that's why we are able to get those part per trillion ranges. There's an efficiency with carbon that's a bit unique. A lot of stuff is really good at the higher end, and its mass or its efficiency is better, mass reduction is better at the higher end, whereas with carbon, again, any form of carbon, it can perform at these lower ends and get us to those part per trillion ranges. And to give you an example, a relative example, you can see here PCE, which nobody would argue is a good candidate for absorption with carbon. You can see that to get the same reduction in those contaminant concentrations, the same endpoint, we need about 2 to 3 times less carbon with PFO and PFOS, which are kind of the two big celebrities, right? So this stuff loves to be absorbed, right? They have very good, favorable absorption isotherms. Now it's different for all these different compounds, right? It's not the same for some of these shorter chain or some different functional groups. But certainly the ones that we're currently looking at that are potentially going to be regulated or are regulated in some states are very good candidates for carbon, which is why it's been proven and used in a lot of places. So internally, what we've been using is a software called PlumeForce. This was developed by Dr. Jeremy Bernstein out of England. And this is a long-term prediction model. It's a finite difference model that allows us to look at fate and transport for carbon and these contaminants, including PFAS, in the subsurface. So it looks a lot of different things. So competitive absorption. So absorption isn't a permanent process. I'll make sure I'm clear on that. There is competitive absorption between the different molecules of these different contaminants, and it's dynamic, it's changing all the time. There is degradation that occurs in the subsurface. Now this isn't for PFAS, but a lot of these plumes are commingled. So if you have a chlorinated solvent or hydrocarbon, these things can be degraded, and while that's happening, it's opening up new absorption sites and regenerating the carbon naturally in situ. So we can look at that dynamic process as well. And then each one of these compounds has a different isotherm. And so we're looking at those different isotherms for the different compounds. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on here, and I'll mention that the isotherms are different for granular activated carbon versus colloidal activated carbon for the same compound. There's actually generally orders of magnitude better absorption for smaller particles. So lots of things going on, but we can look at any point in time and space within that model and see what's going on with absorption. So there's a lot of things that are fixed. Some of these parameters that are specific to the geology, the porosity, for example, those sort of things, those are fixed. But then we have all these other things we can start to manipulate. The dimensions of the barrier, the width and the vertical treatment interval, the length of it. And then we can start playing around with the dosing. And so we can start to predict longevity, or we can say, well, we want to target a particular longevity, and this is what it's going to need to look like to do that. So this boils down to the longevity, at least, to something called retardation factors. So what happens when you add activated carbon to the subsurface is that you're essentially altering the fraction organic carbon, and you're changing the distribution coefficient, the KD value. So this is a ratio between the groundwater and the soil concentrations. And what we find is that when we add activated carbon to the subsurface, we're increasing that KD value, the distribution coefficient, by orders of magnitude. But we're not decreasing the transmissivity or the hydraulic properties of the subsurface. I just put up there an example of an EPA online calculator that's the equation that you probably can't read, but retardation factor is very much affected by the value of this KD distribution coefficient. And if you're not familiar with this term, the retardation factor, or as a reminder, so this is essentially the velocity of the groundwater and the relative velocity of the contaminant in that groundwater. So for example, with an R value of 1, the molecule of groundwater and of water and contaminant are moving at the same velocity. An R value of 2, the contaminant's moving at half that velocity, etc. So generally in natural soils, what we see for like VOCs, volatile organic carbons, is that we see about a value of 1 to 3 for R, right? So when we add a little bit of carbon, which would be the equivalent of fraction organic carbon is 0.001, at 100 part per billion plume of TCE, we'd see that retardation factor shoot up to about 600, okay? Now what that means is I've essentially spliced time into that zone, and I've slowed that molecule down by 600 times of what it naturally would have wanted to move at. So that's pretty significant, right? But it gets really crazy when we look at the same sort of change in fraction organic carbon for, say, 100 part per trillion PFOA plume, a dilute plume, which wouldn't be unusual to see that concentration. We now have an R value of 12,600. So, right, this is a slowing down of that contaminant molecule movement through that barrier. So that's pretty significant. And to give you a better translation of that, so if we do the math, this is a list of different things, different PFAS compounds going from lower molecular weight up to higher molecular weight. You can see at the bottom we have a groundwater velocity where through this zone what we're going to treat, it's going to take about 20 days to get through, right, to move that pore volume through. So if we have 100 part per trillion concentration of any of these compounds and we change the dosing or add the carbon to create a 0.001 value of the fraction organic carbon, what you see is significant increases in the amount of time it takes for those compounds to move through. That red line represents compounds. Those compounds above it are ones that are currently regulated at some place, somewhere in the country, not necessarily in Florida. But what you see is the number of years it would take for that molecule to essentially move through there is anywhere from 100 to 1,700 years. So a century to millennium for those compounds with really a slight adjustment to the subsurface with that carbon addition. So not necessarily forever, but pretty good long time, definitely after our retirement. So that's good, right? So there's been a lot of, again, third-party modeling to corroborate this. Dr. Grant Carey with Pore Water Solutions, one of the, I think the first in situ application of carbon for treatment of PFAS, that was modeled, and he did some very complex calculations that if you want to dig into this really deep, I recommend you look at that. If you don't sleep well at night, these types of papers are also very good as sleep aids, but there is a lot of good information in here for you guys to pour into that came from others. All right, final question. So can we really apply successfully a carbon filter into the subsurface? And what's that look like? How do we get the right amount of the carbon in the right place? And some of the things I'm going to point out here, I would say don't look at it as this is just for carbon technologies. These are things we should be thinking about in any in situ remediation approach. So the first is what we call design verification testing, DVT. And essentially what this is a pre-full-scale application step. So you're mobilizing out to the field, but what you're looking for is specific to remedial design. So we're going to look at things that really are about the application, the dosing, things that are specific to the remedial design. And it's going to happen before we go out and do this full scale. And I'm going to point out that delineation for risk is not the same as delineation for remediation. So that means this is not just a bunch more assessment. We're going to use different tools that wouldn't be a part of the normal process for assessing the delineating a plume, for example, for risk. And that can look like a lot of different things. Flux is really important, so we're going to do some things for flux. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Maybe it's about the tooling and the type of equipment that we use, or it's about the injectability of the aquifer. What's the volumetric acceptance rate of the aquifer? Can we do some clean water injection testing to test that? And then what that allows us to do is go back and refine and optimize the model that we originated from the earlier assumptions. So now we got some real field data to support that. And we've looked at this at a lot of sites. Early on, we looked at several dozen sites and said, well, what are we finding? And there are about 5 general categories of stuff, if you will, that we call technical blind spots, things that were data gaps that, if we hadn't identified them, likely would have caused performance issues for the project. And that's happening at about 80% of sites that we looked at. And generally what we found is about 2/3 of those we needed to go back and refine the model. And what was interesting is it's generally a redistribution of things. It's often not a cost increase or change, it's neutral, but it does allow us to get this calibrated right, move the dosing right, the volume right, things of that nature. Maybe we got to change a tooling that we're going to use. There's a lot of different categories of things we might find that are essential to remedial design. So here's some examples of DVT elements. Right, this is meant to overwhelm you. There's a lot of stuff on this slide, and that's because there's a lot of options. And that's going to be dependent upon how much resolution do you want, what's your budget, where are the data gaps. So, but I will point out that there are 4 general categories for, again, this is in situ remediation, subsurface injections. So we're going to look at soil physical properties. We're going to look at transport zones and contaminant flux. We're going to look at injection rates and the distribution testing, and then the soil and groundwater chemistry. So those 4 general umbrellas are the types of things that we need to fill in the buckets to really get things right. So this is one example, and I think it's one of the most important tools that are out there. So flux is vitally important to a barrier design. Mass flux is because we want to know how much of something is moving through that perpendicular plane over time. We've got to get that right. So what this does, this is a flux meter, and allows us to measure that vertically over the interval that we would be treating in, and we can look at distribution of contaminant concentrations as well as the Darcy velocity over that. And we can then take that information and figure out the mass flux across that entire zone. I'm going to point out something that's, I think, really important. So this isn't a pump-based test, it's an absorption-based test. And we often want to take that kind of information from like a pump-based test and apply the hydraulic conductivity values or porosities and just put them across the entire design. But absorption-based tests allows us to directly normalize that information and eliminate the error that compounds when we assume like, oh, well, the effective porosity is this for the whole thing, or conductivity is this for the whole thing. This normalizes the entire process. So we want to use absorption-based tests for absorption-based strategies, pump-based tests for pump-based strategies. And then again, we go back and we take this information and we get real surgical, right? We're going to pinpoint where we want our dosing, how we want it to be applied, what intervals are different than others, so across that entire barrier, we're not necessarily doing the same thing. Probably shouldn't be doing the same thing. And then the way this works is very simple. It's deployed into an existing, usually 2-inch monitoring well. And then after 2 weeks, you pull it out. There's an alcohol dye that's been washed out, and then we can translate that to the Darcy velocity, and then we can look at the contaminant distribution profile, and then use all that information to back out mass flux calculations and look at how the stuff is distributed. So kind of a general output might look like this, right? You have different heterogeneities, different fluxes, different velocities, and then we can use that to go back into the design. And one other thing I'm going to point out, so that was all pre-application, right? Pre-full-scale stuff. So now we're out in the field, and it doesn't stop. We don't stop refining. We don't stop optimizing because we're in the field and, well, we did all this refinement of our design. Now we're in the field, and we're going to make sure we got it right. So we do something we like to call placement validation. And one of the great things about carbon is it's its own tracer, right? It's like using a dye of sorts. So there's a couple things that we can do. One is just pull cores, right? While you're out there putting in, injecting, a lot of times we're using direct push, for example. We might pull cores and look at those and make sure we got the proper distribution, that we're getting the right radius of influence that we designed for, and we can make adjustments accordingly. Either spread it out, push, change volumes, move the point spacing. That can happen real time, and it should, if things don't look like the design says it should. Another thing we might do is put in piezometers at different intervals away from injection points. And we can confirm and look at different distances away from the injection point. What's our actual radius of influence? And we may also look at the actual monitoring wells. We should see influence in the monitoring wells, and we can pull those samples. We can use colorimetric test kits and say, hey, this is the concentration we're getting. Here's what our in situ injection design concentration was. How do those things look compared to each other? So again, this is all happening in real time, so the designer's involved. He's on the phone while you got the field crew and the project management team, and then you've also got everybody working together making decisions with the field crew real time to make those adjustments. So very powerful way of doing what I call dynamic remediation. And we should do it on all sites if you're involved with in situ remediation sites. This isn't unique to carbon. So, all that being said, hopefully we've covered these questions. So how does this fit with remediation when there's no degradation or destruction? So I'm going to say check. How long will this last? What's the longevity? How can we predict it? What's the model say? Check. And can we effectively implement colloidal activated carbon barrier? How do we do that? Check. Hopefully I've answered those questions for you guys. If I haven't, I'll be happy to take some, and appreciate your time, guys.
Are there any questions for Chad? Right in the back, sir. Yep. Can you pass him the microphone? Hang on a second. They're gonna get you a microphone so everybody can listen. I don't hear you.
Hey, Chad, thank you. It's Clint with CDM. Have you ever ground truthed any of those models with actual field data? I know it sounds like you've only been using plume stop for PFAS for about the past 5 years, but have you compared? I mean, everything can look good in the model, but it kind of can be biased based upon your assumptions and who's running the model.
Yep,
So,
good question. So yeah, we've done a lot of like sensitivity testing and modeling to see what our predicted models match up, especially like when you're looking at like down gradient wells. We can look not just in the barrier, but like, hey, this point 40 feet down gradient, when should we see the concentrations drop? What's that time frame? It's looked pretty good. Those results have been good. We do, on a regular basis, go back to sites and look at performance and try to match the models and make sure that we're on target. But yeah, we are definitely not just modeling it, calling it quits, and walking away. So.
Question over here.
Hey, Chris Phillips, Product Recovery Management. Have a multi-part question. The first part is, what do we know right now about the variability of the sorption properties with the thousands of PFAS, PFOA? Do we lump them together, or do we say this specific compound has this sorption property, next one, what's the variance in that?
Yep. Okay, that's part one?
Yeah.
Okay, so we can do a couple things. One, there's a huge body of evidence, for GAC, for granular activated carbon, right? There's the EPA document that it's about that thick, it's got all the isotherms for GAC. If you wanted to use that, that would be a conservative estimate. Like I said earlier, colloidal carbon is generally orders of magnitude more efficient from absorption standpoint. We're also running individual isotherms. We work with different academia, different universities to get actual isotherms for individual compounds. How many do we have? I don't know exactly right now. I know we have the important ones, but the third thing we would do is make general assumptions about the structure of that compound. So we know that we have this many carbons for this one, we have this functional group, it looks like this one, it's probably gonna have a KOC value approximately X, so we can approximate that pretty good. And we've done relative studies in our own lab showing the differences, say, in carbon chain lengths and different functional groups to look at relative absorption as well.
Okay.
That's a multi-part answer. Go ahead.
My second part of the question goes along with what the other gentleman was asking about. Have there been any studies for competing solutions for the PFAS, PFOA absorption with the colloidal activated carbon?
So what do you mean by competing solutions?
Let's say something comes along and kicks off the PFAS, PFOA.
Okay, yeah. So in our models, we do look at what we call non-target species. So that would mean stuff that, the other organic matter and things of that nature, again, are competing just like those other contaminant compounds and molecules are. There are some general assumptions in that we have to kind of apply, kind of like we would for, like in hydrocarbon world, we would apply TPH, right? TPH is kind of a gross parameter to capture the broader mass that's there. It's not specific to each individual compound. But for those non-target compounds, we can make those sort of assumptions for the other organic matter that does have an impact on the carbon. For example, if you have a landfill and you have a lot of TOC coming out of it, that definitely can put a absorption demand on the carbon. So we do look at all those sort of factors in the modeling.
Okay, and is there anything you can do like prophylactically to be looking out for that?
A lot of that is up front in that DVT effort when we talk about soil and groundwater chemistry and making sure we have all the parameters that may also affect carbon absorption. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good questions, thank you.
Yep, there's a next question right there.
Zeke?
Hey, Chad.
Morning.
About the retardation, I think this is the first time I saw PFOA, had much higher retardation than PFAS. How was that calculated?
The difference in the relative absorption you're referring to, or?
On one of your slides,
Uh-huh.
you showed the PFOA retardation about 12,000, PFAS about 8,000.
Well, those retardation factors are very dependent upon what's the concentration in the plume, the conditions, how much do we change the dosing, the fraction organic carbon, right? I said, the equivalent with 0.001. So however those parameters are adjusted, it's going to change that calculated R value. So I think that's probably why.
Oh, I see.
Yep.
From different
Different dosing, different plume concentrations, yep. Mm-hmm. Oh, he's coming to get you.
Let me get you because we're recording.
You guys are wearing me out. It's a little early for all these questions.
Is this a lot cheaper than like an old-fashioned bentonite slurry wall or something?
Yes, from a mechanical installation standpoint alone, right? Materials, aren't, I won't speak to unit rates on any of that because I couldn't tell you exactly, but certainly from a mechanical installation standpoint, going out there with some direct push injection points would be much easier than trying to apply a bentonite slurry wall or cement wall, I would say, yes. We're using it in some cases as a substitute for those kind of applications, in fact. So allowing passive movement of the groundwater instead of trying to stop it, because think about trying to stop this wall of water also requires other levels of hydraulic control and other problems that get created because of it. Yeah.
Hey, Chad, there's been some resistance from regulatory agencies regarding the long-term stability.
I don't know when there's ever not been regulatory resistance, but
Have you presented some of your modeling on the longevity to some of the regulations?
We have, you know, and there's two boxes here, right? One, or buckets, if you will. One is the fact that we have compounds that do degrade, and we can provoke that. We can add co-reagents to hasten and long-term allow degradation of the contaminants that are absorbed. Then we have PFAS, which is, hey, we are not degrading or destroying this compound. We're just telling you we can keep it hung up for decades, if not centuries, in that zone. And it's a lot better hanging out in that zone that's 10 feet wide than the 10-mile wide plume that you're going to have otherwise. Yeah. Some people agree to that, others are still hung up on it. So, yeah.
I have a quick question about the shorter chain, the PFPEA, PFBA, that didn't have a really good retardation factor. Is there a look at playing on the ionic end of some of these surfactants when they're shorter chain and less likely to, you know, interact or absorb hydrophobically, to kind of have that combined ball there?
So, well, I'd say that saying that it didn't have a good retardation factor is relative, right? How many years do you want to manage it? That was just based on particular dosing, and we could increase the dosing to allow for better longevity, right? So it's just adding more of that same thing. There's limitations on volume and stuff like that. You know, ultimately, and I think to answer your question, I see carbon as a platform for any contaminant. Right? And in time, innovation is going to keep driving what we're doing, the things that we're seeing every year here. There's going to be destructive technologies that can be compatible, I think, with the carbon technology. So we will be able to destroy it and degrade it while it's being captured and absorbed in that zone. So we're getting there, I think. Thanks.
Hope you have energy for one more question.
Okay, just one more.
One more. What is the longevity of this colloidal activated carbon? Is it 5 years, 10 years? Because when it begins to break down, what's going to happen to all of these compounds that are absorbed?
Right.
What's going to be their fate? And the second part of the question is, you mentioned some other TOCs that can leach from some specific sites, but in groundwater, is there other compounds that can competitively absorb and displace or just prevent PFAS from being absorbed, like humans or something else?
Yep.
They're constantly there at much higher concentration. They don't have to have the same kind of constants, absorption constants as PFAS, but because they're present in much higher concentration, they just simply will prevent PFAS from absorbing.
Right. So yeah, the first part is that, you know, activated carbon, remember, is not natural organic matter. It's been manipulated and modified to not break down or be destroyed the way that normal natural organic matter would degrade. So it really is permanent. It's not going anywhere. It's not going to kind of do what normal organic matter would in the subsurface and just start to break down. So I would think of that as permanent. The second part is, you know, we were talking about a little bit earlier. So for example, humic acid, we could use that as a placeholder for these other natural organic matter type stuff that does occur in the subsurface. And we include that as part of that modeling, because that's an example of a non-target species, right? That's there, that's putting a demand on the carbon, but that just means we have to have enough dosing to account for the demand placed on the carbon by that, plus all the other stuff, right? It's the same like with an electron donor. It's not just the contaminant mass that's causing the demand. Usually it's actually the other electron acceptors and things that are causing more of the demand. Or same thing for a chemical oxidant. All these things have other stuff, and if you don't take that into consideration, then you're missing a big part of the modeling for sure and what's required. Yeah. I'm not aware of its shelf life in terms of it ever breaking down. It binds to that matrix, the soil matrix, and it's going to stay there. I'll get a better answer for you from a lot of people that are smarter than I am, but my understanding is that activated carbon's not going to change form or shape or give up that stuff.
Just fighting fire with fire, a forever chemical with another forever chemical, really. But any questions? We do have plenty of time. We got over 45 minutes, correct, Gene?
Well, the other thing we can do is I think we've got Zoom.
Yeah, we got Zoom, and I got a few more comments.
If we break a little early, that's okay. I'll just move everything up of that amount of time.
Yeah, that'd be
It'll
fine.
get us out of here early. Got one more question here.
We got a few more questions, so.
Since we have plenty of time, I'll answer. A crazy question. you know, I understand the mechanism for the activated carbon, and it works. I was curious as far as a more permanent absorption of it, if anybody in their crazy, you know, thoughts has looked at using colloidal mica minerals, which would then have the layers collapse over the organic compound and sort of keep it there for eternity.
What was the element?
Mica.
Oh, mica.
Mica will have expanded layers in there,
Mm-hmm.
and then if a large atom gets in there, it'll squeeze in there and get tightly fixed, and then the other layers fall around it.
Yeah, I think
so
it's
permanent.
Yeah, the conceptual problem with that, I think, would be we're trying not to change the hydraulic properties of the aquifer. We want it to behave as it did before we injected the carbon. So when you start talking about larger things or layering in things like that, then you're going to start creating something that's less permeable and not going to behave in the same manner. So I think that would be the challenge. But yeah, conceptually the idea is there, but what does that mean for the subsurface?
I think, there's a common theme perhaps that needs to be said in my experience here. It's, in Florida at least, the groundwater, surface water interlink is going to be very important. And you heard it from Blaine, Ms. Evans, and Chad. You know, Florida is devoting a lot of resources to protect the surface waters. The Tampa site is located in a peninsula. Some of my clients may be discharging into surface waters of the state. Some water bodies have the highest degree of protection. They are outstanding Florida waters with zero degradation. So I think part of the common theme is to not only evaluate what groundwater may be doing, because we can address groundwater, as Chad said, we can control the exposure. But once that chemical hits surface water, all bets are off, you know. And so I think knowing that eventually surface water PFAS discharges will be regulated just like they are in terms of, you read EPA yesterday saying effluent discharges will be regulated. That really means one thing: surface water standards are coming at some point in time in the future. I think in Florida, part of the assessment is to evaluate not only additional sources, but what is the groundwater, surface water interlink. So I would emphasize that point for all of you. The other point I want to emphasize is exactly what Chad alluded, the retardation factors. We as a society are used to the silver bullet, you know. I mean, we want it fast now, right away. But in this case, as you can see from Chad's presentation, the retardation factors retard these plumes for hundreds of years. And it's widely recognized that right now, at this point, all the technologies in terms of destroying the chemical or separating those into elemental parts do not exist. So again, we keep thinking we're not going to have a technology that does this in, 5 years, or remediate the aquifer in 5 years. I mean, and if we have more chemicals being regulated, we need to realize that some water bodies or portions of the aquifer are not going to be available in Florida for water resource planning. And so that is the next step. This is the paradigm change we've been talking with DEP. You know, the rule says you got to clean to a GCTL, but we have been expecting we're going to reach GCTL in about 10 years for most contaminants, or M&A. This is not going to happen that fast. And what do we do with those water resources? They're not available for human consumption. Certainly, nobody wants to drink PFAS. So that's the paradigm change we want to see. One, start focusing on surface water discharges, and there is a screening level that's based on human ingestion of fish. We don't have anything yet in terms of harm of these substances to biota. And the other one is exactly what Chad alluded is, it's going to take time, and it's not going to be a silver bullet. Chad even recognizes that it may be a train. It may be, activated carbon extraction and filtration to membranes, but along the way, somebody's going to come up with maybe plasma and start breaking these things down. But meanwhile, we have a duty to protect the public in the sense of saying, this water body, this portion of the aquifer, there is no way it can be accessed while we look for a solution. So keep those things in mind as we move forward. And next year we can discuss where the EP is moving in that regard. So thank you, Chad. We do have an extra presentation. Any more questions for any of the distinguished panelists here? Yes.
Hang on one sec.
Hi. I'm just curious if it works in salt or brackish waters?
Yeah, the difference in ionic solutions, carbon's pretty tolerant of that, so it would have to be pretty extreme. But yeah, we use it in brackish and saline type waters all the time by the coast for other compounds more specifically. We've done that with petroleum hydrocarbons, especially like in Florida along the coast. And so yes, it's still effective that way.
Any other questions before we go on to the next presenter? Next one we have Zoom. Nguyen, Zoom, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
I know we had some audio issue yesterday, so I came to the office and used different headsets, so hopefully it's a little better today. All right, so just to save bandwidth, I'm gonna turn off my camera and turn it on during Q&A, and I'll go ahead and start my screen. Just let me know when you guys can see my screen here. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Coming up. Zoom, hang on.
Is it coming up yet?
Not yet, not yet. They're working on it.
All right.
I can tap dance for all of you, you know. Maybe some salsa dance. There you go. Hang on, Zoom.
Yeah, no worries.
Hang on. I'm looking at the gentleman's working, the gentleman working here.
Hey, Zoom, can you turn on your camera?
Yeah.
Go ahead and turn on your camera.
Yep,
All right,
got it.
now share your screen.
There we go.
Okay.
Wait a minute, there it goes.
Is it working now?
Yes.
Give me an HDMI. Give me an HDMI. Give me an HDMI.
Okay, there we go, I think. Oops.
Hang on one sec, Zoom.
Yeah, no worries.
Yes, I don't hear him.
I'm happy to email the presentation to Eugene, for example, if that's better.
Yeah, Zoom, why don't we do this since we've just lost connection?
Oh,
Wait a minute, hang on.
Sure.
here he is.
Zoom, we can see your screen.
Okay, great. All right, so we can go ahead and get started.
Yeah, can you go launch full screen on yours?
Don't get
Yeah, it's
There we
actually
go.
full screen on mine
All right.
right now.
All right, we're good. Go ahead.
Okay, all right, cool. Okay, everyone's still good? think.
Yep.
All right. Thanks again for having me, guys, and sorry again I couldn't join you guys in person. So the title of my second presentation for this event is PFAS leaching from AFFF-Impacted source areas. And before I get started, I'd just like to thank my key collaborators and CERTA for funding this project. So this project is led by C.D.M. Smith, myself, and Charles Schaefer. We also get support from APTIM, Dave Lippincott, and Greg Livornia. School of Mines has been helping us with a lot of the analytical work you guys can see in this presentation, as well as Oregon State University, Jennifer Field, and Emerson Christie. So this is project startup ER 18-1224, and the overall objective of this project is to look into insights of how PFAS discharge, from AFFF, fatal zone into groundwater. And fundamentally, some of the key questions that we're trying to answer is, what is the nature of PFAS release, from unsaturated, zone into groundwater? And what is the impact of wetting and drying cycles? We talked a bit about, air-water interfacial coefficients yesterday and how that is important for compounds or surfactants like PFAS. And then we want to understand as the flux changes over time, how does that impact, groundwater mass discharge? And ultimately, we want to see if we can develop a simple model to predict how mass discharge changes over time. So sorry to throw out some equations so early in the morning, but EPA and state agency over the years have developed soil screening criteria. And essentially the gist of it is that, say we go out to the field with a DBT rig, right? And what you're measuring in the soil sample is the term on the left, is a CT, which is a total concentration. So that's what's in the soil, what's in the pore water, and what's in the pore volume of that particular sample. And the pore water, which is the CP term on the right there, is actually a function of, we can kind of predict that if you know the soil concentration, if you know the KD, which is the soil water partitioning coefficient. It also relates to moisture content and bulk density. So that's a traditional approach. And this is very appropriate for a number of compounds, including chloride solvents, TPH, and things of that nature. For PFAS, there's a third term that you see in the equation below, and that third term accounts for the partitioning of PFAS into air-water interface, or the air-water interfacial area in the soil. And if you ignore the third term, what you can do is actually overestimate the PFAS mass present in pore water, which would contribute to groundwater contamination. So in this presentation, we'd like to go over some of the site characterization that we did at a field site, how we took some of the soil from the site, took it back to our lab, do some bench scale testings to determine desorption kinetics, desorption isotherms. And then we go out to the field again and apply, some of the findings from the bench to see how the bench and the field data would correlate. And I guess, the key finding from this study is that, simple bench testings can be used to estimate PFAS mass leaching with a relatively high level of confidence. So the site that we picked, for this kind of demonstration project is the Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst, or JBMDL, located in New Jersey. And the area that we worked at is actually in the Lakehurst portion of the site. This is Lakehurst Historic Fire Training Area number 1. And I guess one fun fact about JBMDL is that it's the DoD, Department of Defense's only tri-service facility hosting the Navy, Air Force, and the Army. And at this particular site, we kind of work in a fenced-in area near building 691. And at this site, there was no firefighting reported. There's no firefighting activities whatsoever. But they did do kind of monthly film reading from the late 80s to the early 2000s, essentially. And discharge, goes into dumpsters, but overflow often happens. And there was reports that during heavy rain events, the groundwater surface, the groundwater near the surface would foam, which is usually a pretty good indication that you have AFFF impacts. And the other two reasons why we picked this site is that in terms of lithology, it's a very silty site, very good percolation rate. Prior to doing any testing, we actually go out there and did a very, very quick and dirty percolation test to make sure that we can do enhanced flushing very easily at this site. The site also has relatively shallow groundwater ranging between 6 and 9 feet below ground surface. So we went out and we did P2 rig, advanced a dozen or so soil borings and collected soil samples for bench testings as well. So this slide right here, slide number 7, shows PFAS concentration in the soil as a function of depth. As you can see, most of the PFAS can really be found within the upper foot or so of the soil. And we have the water table shown right here between about 5.5 to 8 feet below ground surface or so. And for arbitrary, we kind of arbitrarily bin the soils into two different categories. We have the shallow soil from 0 to 3. Again, that captures most of the PFAS mass in the soil. And then the deep is from 3 to 8. And one thing I like to point out is that the shallow soil have much higher organic content, compared to the deep soil, about orders or so magnitude difference. And this is this kind of vertical profiling of PFAS concentration in soil and FOC is actually very consistent with several other sites that we see. At most sites that we kind of been to and do this kind of testing, a lot of sites where have the majority of PFAS, kind of really capture within the upper couple of feet of soil. So the other thing that we did, in addition to looking at concentration, is looking at the PFAS composition with depth. So again, lots of color bars right here. So I guess the key takeaway is that there's a lot of sulfidamides, lots of precursors in the surface. In terms of peripheral alkyl acids, PFAS is really the compound that dominates. And there's also is a bit of an interesting fact is that if you look at the the A2FTS precursors, we have a tiny bit of it, very shallow, within a couple of feet of soil or so. And as you transition down into the water table, a lot of that turns into A2FTS. So certainly there was some transformation from the precursors to terminal products there. And then there's, essentially ACF precursors, very predominantly throughout the Vado zone. So one of the first things that we did, we took the soil back to the lab and did a very simple desorption kinetics. And we got the pictures right here showing you guys how we set up the test. So set everything up in a 1 liter HDPE container where we put in some of the soil, homogenized soil, about 100 grams or so of homogenized soil, and about 500 ml of an artificial groundwater. In this particular case, we used 0.01 molar NaCl. And we did this desorption kinetic test, for both the deep soil and the shallow soil, where we kind of go in and collect supernatant as a function of time. And we took samples out to about 400 hours. And we have data shown here for the shallow soil only, simply because for the deep soil, it was not very exciting. We essentially reached equilibrium for nearly all compounds for the deep soil within about 48 hours. Again, the deep soil is the soil with much lower FOC, and the shallow soil is the soil with much higher PFAS concentration and much higher TOC or FOC as well. So for the FOC, we got for the shallow soil, we have a couple of charts to show you guys here. And the upper chart shows the equilibrium for short chain compounds, including PFBS, PFEPS, and PFHPS. And for the bottom charts on the left corner here, we have the equilibrium for long chain compounds, including PFHXS and PFOX. And the takeaway is that the equilibrium took much longer for the shallow soil, as I mentioned. And for some of the compounds, we saw increasing concentration for a lot of the short chain compounds even after 400 hours. For PFHPS, PFOS, and PFNA, we can attain equilibrium within about 48 hours or so. So a lot of this, is actually very consistent with the classic, two-site desorption model, which assumes that some fraction of sites would rapidly equilibrate with the surrounding water, whereas, there are a fraction of sites where you have kind of mass transfer limitations or some sort of other kinetic limitation. So again, a bit more differential equations very early in the morning, so I apologize for that. But we look at compounds that are really slowly coming off of the soil, and in this case, we're looking at PFHXS, and again, applying a classic two-site desorption model. And in this case, we fit the experimental data with the model, and the only parameter that we really have to fit is the alpha term, which is the desorption rates, which is looking at PFHXS, you look at the chart on the upper left right here, and we have a pretty good linear regression here between the aqueous equation and the alpha term. And then just to prove ourselves that this all makes sense, we actually plot the desorption constant, rate constant, which is the alpha terms for the different compounds with different aqueous diffusivity constant, which is what you can see in the lower charts right here. And as you can see, the aqueous diffusivity increases with the as the alpha term increases. And this confirmed that the release of these compounds, these long chain compounds, is actually related to diffusion or to mass transfer release. And what this means is that, at a lot of sites, you may have very, very slow desorption of some of the long chain PFAS compounds. And this also means that for a lot of models that's typically used to predict leaching, that's based on equilibrium, that may not be appropriate for PFAS, especially for short chain PFAS. And that you actually might have to consider some of the mass transfer kinetic limitations I mentioned earlier. And this also helps explains why, for a lot of these AFFF source areas, you have rainfall, you have, desorption for decades, and, for whatever reason, right? When you go back to these sites, 2 or 3 decades later, you're still seeing a lot of mass, especially for a lot of these, long chain compounds. And this also have, significant consideration in terms of remedial design, and we'll talk about that in the next few slides here. So moving on from the kinetic test, we actually set up the next test, which is the sequential batch dilution test, to measure the desorption isotherm. And again, we did it for both the shallow and the deep soil. So what we did was we essentially repeat the test, but this time we kind of go in every 2 weeks or so, replace the supernatant with PFAS-free artificial water. So we do that, essentially for up to 8 events. And again, measure the supernatant, the water as a function of time. And what we have plotted here is the PFAS concentration in soil in the y-axis by the aqueous concentration in the x-axis. One thing I'd like to point out is that for the aqueous equation, the aqueous concentration actually plotted in log scale. So if you look at the shallow soil and maybe just look at PFAS, which is plotted on the secondary y-axis here, what you can see is that the aqueous concentration dropped a lot faster than the soil concentration, right? And this equation is essentially a semi-log equation. What it shows is the slope of this equation is essentially the effective KD, or the soil desorption coefficient. And the y-intercept here, which is in the millions, essentially the fraction of soil that is resistant to desorption. And some people like to term it the irreversibly absorbed fraction of soil. Mass of PFAS mass in the soil. So what it shows right here is that for several compounds that we look at, long chain compounds like PFHXS or PFOS in the shallow soil, that there's a pretty big fraction of the soil, the absorbed mass, that is not readily absorbed. So the other thing that we discussed earlier that is very important, right, in predicting PFAS mass discharge is the uptake of PFAS at the air-water interface, or the KAW. So there are several methods that we publish on how to measure KAW in the lab at field relevant concentrations. And one of the methods is shown right here on the upper right corner, which is what we call the pan film experiment, or the pan film technique. So it's actually very simple. So you can take your pore water, your groundwater, your diluted AFFF, you put it in a pan film like this, put a little bit of volume to it, let it equilibrate over, function of time. And we have a bottom port right here where you can essentially drain out the majority of the bulk solution. And then you can collect, the very thin microfilm layer. And by measuring the concentration of the bulk solution and the concentration of PFAS absorbed onto the air-water interface, you can essentially derive this KAW coefficient. And the other technique that we use is a steel screen method. And this is a classic approach that people usually use to interrogate microlayers of water surfaces. And again, using either method, you can actually derive the KAW function for all PFAS compound at relatively low concentrations very, very easily. And again, the other thing I'd like to point out, similar to my presentation yesterday, is that you actually can see essentially an increase in KAW at lower concentrations. And what it means is that this, air-water interfacial partitioning coefficient is actually even more important at lower concentrations. So this is something that is very important for us to consider at field relevant PFAS concentrations. So how do we use all of this information? So I guess the gist of what I just presented is that the bench scale test can be used as a very quick and dirty way to determine PFAS desorption parameters, and also as well as to determine the air water partitioning coefficient. And the next thing I wanted to talk to you guys about is how do we use this information and how this information can be used to relate to a field study. So with help from the Optum team, we actually went out to the Lakehurst site and installed this test cell. So this slide right here shows the schematic of the field test cell, measuring about 14 feet by 14 feet. And we use interlocking sheet piles that are driven down to the water table to essentially hydraulically isolate the area both vertically and laterally. And within the test cells, we have a series of suction cup lysimeters. We have 11 of them. We also have 4 open drainage lysimeters, and all of these lysimeters would install between 0.5 and 5 feet below ground surface. So essentially, right above the water table, but essentially below the depth where we would capture the majority of the PFAS mass discharge from the radial zone to groundwater. Within the test wells, we also have 3 moisture probes, 1 rain gauge, essentially to help us determine the infiltration rate. We also have a series of pop-up irrigation sprinklers. We have essentially 9 of them, and these are sprinklers that you usually use in your lawn, in your garden to irrigate your lawn. And again, we use the pop-up sprinklers to irrigate the systems for enhanced flushing. If you guys are not familiar with lysimeters, I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes here explaining what it is and what it's used for. So we bought these lysimeters from a company called Soil Moisture, and if you go to soilmoisture.com, you can essentially take a look at all these suction cup lysimeters. And what it really is a 2-inch ID PVC casing with a ceramic cup at the bottom. This is a ceramic cup at the bottom right here. And installation can be done very easily. These lysimeters come in various lengths, so you can install them from essentially, right at the surface down to about 8 feet below ground surface using pretty simple hand tools. And the way that I would explain to people is that you essentially think of the installation of lysimeters as you would for like a very shallow soil probe. So what we typically do is to use a soil auger. We usually use a stainless steel soil auger with a 3.5, 4-inch ID. We auger down to depth to create an open borehole. And then we essentially put down the lysimeters, and we use a 200 mesh, silica flour slurry. We mix that in with water and essentially create a filter pack, for the ceramic cup. And then we put a tiny bit of silica sand on top of the silica flour layer before we essentially seal up the hole using bentonite chips. And the reason why we have a bit of silica sand here just to prevent migration of the bentonites into the silica flour. And I got a couple of pictures on the right here, showing you guys what it really looks like. So this is the lysimeter sticking up from the ground after it's been installed. And to essentially to apply a vacuum, you actually use a hand pump like this. And once you're ready to collect a sample, you actually can use a hand pump again. You use a very skinny HDPE tubing, stick that all the way down to the ceramic cup, and then use the hand pump to essentially apply a vacuum. And you can essentially pour water directly into your sample containers or through like a holding vessel like this. So again, very, very simple to do. So before I move any further, I just want to spend a minute or two to talk about some important considerations that we want to take into account when you use lysimeters. So just like with any other kind of PFAS investigation or characterization work, want to make sure that all of your components are PFAS free. And so what we typically do is to decon of our equipment with methanol and with PFAS free water before we put anything into the ground. A couple of other things that we wanted to do as part of this project as well was to determine and to make sure that we don't have PFAS absorption onto the silica flowers, which have very small mesh size. We also wanted to make sure that we have negligible PFAS absorption onto the ceramic cup. And I'm not sharing the data right here because just in the interest of time, but we have data to show that there's very little absorption of PFAS onto both the silica flower as well as into the ceramic cup. And as I mentioned earlier in this slide, that we use a silica flour slurry. Essentially, we mix the slurry with the silica flour in water, but we typically add in a tiny bit of bromide as well. just to account for any dilution. And then as a rule of thumb, the first round of samples of pore waters we usually discard it, again, just to, to minimize any impacts of dilution or, any of that sort on your data. Slide number 17 right here, we have a few pictures showing you guys the field systems. Again, this is the interlocking sheet piles that we driven all the way to the water table. Key that into the underlying clay to hydraulically isolate the system, both laterally and vertically. And in the middle of the test cells is our monitoring well. Got a series of lysimers all around. It's a bit hard to see, but we have proper sprinklers in the corners and all around the test cells. I got pictures of our Atom field personnel right here, holding different sizes, different lysimers of different length. And in order to automate the system, we actually have a Connex box, with some pretty simple PC, to help us automate the sampling system. We actually built this manifold system to allow us to collect, pore water samples from all 11 lysimers, simultaneously. And one more thing I'd like to point out is that we actually put down a couple of inches of clean silica sand on top of this soil surface. So that way, as we start the enhanced flushing on the irrigation, we don't have water splashing around, and that's really to help, essentially the water percolate vertically instead of splashing laterally. This summarizes essentially the field testing. So we did, 3 rounds of ambient monitoring, essentially without any irrigation. And we did several rounds of enhanced flushing over the course of about 2 years period. And the equivalent rainfall amount that we added to these test cells is the equivalent to about 22 something years of rainfall in New Jersey. So I've got a couple of slides right here showing you guys the initial rounds of lysimer sampling. So everything is plotted in log scale. Again, this is results from 3 rounds from 4 deeps and from 4 shallow lysimeters for all these different PFAS compounds. And again, the gist of this chart is that, as a function of time, a function of depth, we did see very, very good reproducible results. So that give us some level of comfort that, if we use the lysimeters, regardless of which lysimeters you use, and as a function of depth, we are going to see pretty good consistent results under ambient conditions at least. And this next slide shows the impacts of rapid wetting. So essentially, this is what's going to happen to the PFAS, right? When we have high rain events, and in our cases, this is under high irrigation events. And what I have here is the orange is the ambient concentrations, and the open triangles are the concentration of PFAS during flushing. And we have 2 charts, one shown up here for PFAS, which long chain compounds with very high surface activities, and one for PFBS, which is essentially the opposite end, right? So short chain compounds with much lower surface activity. So what you can see is that you will see a very high initial increase in PFAS after flushing. And we think that this is likely due to collapse of the air-water interface. And you don't see that with the PFBS, and that's because PFBS doesn't have as high of a KAW. So this chart right here really shows the importance of considering KAW into your equations when you try to measure pore waters. So how do these field concentrations correlate to the bench test? So this is the measure of pore water concentrations in the field. This is the pore water concentration that can be extracted from the batch desorption data without taking into account the KAW. So this black triangle essentially is the pore water as a CP that we got from these upper equations right here. And when we correct it for the 3rd term, which is the air-water interfacial, as you can see, you actually would get very, very close to the actual concentrations of pore water we measure in the field. Again, just to highlight the importance of this KAW or the air-water interfacial coefficient. And really, this is perhaps the $1 million chart right here. So this is essentially the prediction of PFAS concentration compared to field lysimeters. And again, very similar to what I showed earlier. But this is the field data. This is the model data without that KW interfacial absorption. And this is the data, with the air water interfacial correction. And as you can see, if you don't correct, for the KW, you're gonna get a pore water concentration that would be, 4 times higher than what you see in the field. And this, again, just to highlight the importance of incorporating that KW into your model. So some of the key points that I want to bring up, just to summarize the presentation, is that kinetically controlled absorption can really limit, how much PFAS will be released from the soil. And we show is in some of the earlier slides, the pore water concentration will decrease much faster than the soil concentration. And absorption of PFAS at the air-water interface, also likely mitigates mass flux into groundwater, at least for the very long chain PFAS of regulatory concern, including PFOA and PFOS. And the last point I'd like to point out is that while PFAS mass is likely exists in soil for several decades, the mass flux to groundwater, at least for this particular site, may diminish much more rapidly. So this calls for perhaps the use of enhanced soil flushing. You're not going to remove a lot of the PFAS mass from the soil, but can you remove enough PFAS mass in pore water such that you're not going to have a groundwater contamination concern? So again, this is one site. We are starting to go out to several other sites as part of our other projects. And what we're seeing, at least preliminarily, is that this particular set of data can be used across multiple sites. So give us a lot of confidence that what we're seeing here, at least in this presentation, is not an anomaly. I really feel like what we're presenting here could be a norm for a lot of sites. So again, could be things for us to consider. So anyway, that wraps up my my presentation. And at this time, I'm happy to take any questions anyone may have.
Thank you, Zoom. Any questions for Zoom from the audience? Thank you again. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Oh, there's a question right there. So hang on, Zoom. Don't go anywhere yet.
Since it seems to stay around in the soil for a long time, what are the specific mechanisms for the retention of the PFAS in the soil? We have precipitation, which likely not here. We have physical entrapment in the organic matter. Specifically, what do you see is occurring there that holds on to the PFAS for your prediction for decades?
Yeah, and I think, you kind of answer your own question there. There's a lot of factors. We kind of show the kinetically controlled slow desorption. We showed that for shallow soil, at least in our site here at Lakehurst, for the shallow soil with higher organic, fraction, that tends to absorb onto the PFAS a lot more strongly than the deep soil. So again, at a lot of sites where you have, shallow soil with, with other co-contaminants with high organic content, that just, really are the mechanisms, that would hold on to the PFAS for much longer.
So we would expect to see some soils with high organic matter, 2, 4, 6%, retain it, and those soils with very low organic matter, under a 0.5 percentage point, have it pass through?
Yep, you're exactly right. Yep.
Okay.
That's it. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Zoom.
Thank you, guys.
Good job.
Oh, thank you. I was like, this is a little simple for this room, but hopefully it'll be interesting, because it's like sort of yesterday you heard the regulators, so I thought it might be interesting for people to see on the receiving end, what did those entities have to do?
Absolutely. It's where the rubber hits the road, kind of, right?